The way we relate to ourselves, and the way we relate to other people, has a powerful effect on our health. Our thoughts, emotions, and relationships don't just affect how we feel mentally, they also affect our biology. In the short term, this might look like a racing heart when someone shouts at us, or tension in the body during conflict. But over the long term, these patterns can shape our stress levels, our immune system, and even the kinds of disease symptoms we develop. Critically, some people, often without realizing it, develop personalities and coping styles that are more prone to chronic stress, making them vulnerable to this biological impact later down the line. To really understand where this comes from, we need to look back to development. Human beings have a very long developmental period. Unlike many animals, we're not born ready to survive on our own. We rely heavily on our caregivers to help us regulate our bodies, our emotions, and eventually, our sense of self. Early in life, we form what's called an attachment relationship with our caregivers. This attachment will become the template for how we relate to others, and how we relate to ourselves, later in life. When attachment goes well, it provides a foundation for emotional regulation, self-esteem, and healthy relationships. When it's disrupted or inconsistent, we'll be poorly developed and it will increase our vulnerability to stress. And such, we've got to understand what's key in that attachment relationship. At a basic level, the first thing children need is at least one consistent caregiver. Sometimes, whether through adoption, loss, or stress, this can be disrupted. Beyond just the immediate caregiver though, it is also important to have an attachment village, a community of adults around the child that can help support both the child and the principal caregiver. Nowadays, people often have less of an attachment village, and unfortunately, children largely spend their time outside the home not with the mature adults that help them develop, but with other immature peers their age. This means that any fallibility with the principal caregiver's attachment will not be able to be cushioned by the wider village. However, attachment isn't just about the presence of adults to help us develop. What's key is the quality of those attachments. Children should meet a series of developmental milestones over the course of the childhood, with each requiring the right conditions in the attachment. Caregivers need not to be physically absent in order to not fulfill what the child needs though. A caregiver can be physically present but emotionally unavailable, something known as proximate separation. This might happen if a parent is overwhelmed, chronically stressed, depressed, or distracted. For a child, this can feel just as confusing as physical absence. For children to develop properly, they need not only basic physical care, but to feel a true sense of belonging, relatedness, and connectedness. Children must feel a part of something to be able to build that attachment's foundation. Within it, they must then feel understood and seen. Children are only able to learn what emotions are and how to regulate them, from a caregiver who's important to them tuning into their emotional state and feeling the same, in a process called attunement. When, for example, a child cries, they are met by empathy, an explanation that it is because they are sad, and the lesson that comfort and care help to relieve it. Without that, they'll struggle to develop true emotional regulation or the vocabulary to communicate their emotions. The child also needs to be able to express themselves, be vulnerable, and receive positive affection and unconditional love. It is vital for establishing genuine self-esteem in the child, and going forward with love, care, and understanding for ourselves. The attachment not only wires our psychology though, it also paves the way for our biology. From being attached by the umbilical cord in the womb, to our caregiver relationships in adolescence, our body is constantly being coded by our experiences. At a very young age, we're subconsciously reading off information from our caregivers and tuning our own bodies to fit. We establish our stress levels and hormone cycles like cortisol profiles, and tune up both our immune system and nervous system. As well as understanding our emotions, our caregivers also help us figure out our neurotransmitters, experiencing what dopamine and oxytocin feel like as they soothe a crying baby, and forming our basic biochemistry. We begin to learn our habitual responses to the world, training our implicit physiological memory, and forming those deep emotional memories and triggers in an area of the brain called the limbic system. We, for example, start to associate affection from caregivers with oxytocin, or food with dopamine. Into the toddler and child phase, parents will then help fine-tune the nervous system. During the erratic toddler phase, strict boundaries of yes and no help regulate the toddler's nervous system from its constant switching from lethargy to hyperactivity, to a controlled nervous system regulation. As children age, they then get help to learn complexity, learning that feelings come and go and that they don't have to identify with what they feel at any one moment. They become much more aware of, and conscious, about their own thinking and biases. Then eventually, the goal is for children to develop differentiation, or the ability to self-regulate and operate healthily on their own. Our likelihood to develop certain health conditions later in life can be increased right from the early caregiver interactions. We might have a chronically stressed hormone system, neurotransmitters poorly regulated to give us a lack of attention, or an immune system that's hypersensitive. Physical abuse can prime muscles and cause chronic pain in later life. Or psychologically, we might have a body that has never associated relationships with warmth, or a limbic system conditioned with fear of authority figures. Trauma to young children will be wired into their biology, and can even be passed down intergenerationally. Unhealthy attachment dynamics can also cause problems. Some parents intrude on our boundaries during childhood, whether physically, with hitting or unwanted touching, or psychologically, with a lack of dignity. Perhaps they were controlling, overprotective, had an inflated sense of who they were, or subtly made you feel a sense of shame for something. Parents can also sometimes be extra needy, depending on you as the child, or so absent that you learn to work for attention rather than expect unconditional love. Unhealthy dynamics can go on to form personalities in the adult child, whether it's an overcontrollingness that leads to a child full of oppositionality, or a shame instilled in you that leads to chronic emotional suppression. As an adult, we often don't question our personalities, unaware that some of our traits may come from unhealthy beginnings. We may, for example, proudly believe we're a positive person, unaware of the negative impact suppressing our bad thoughts may be having on us. Spotting unhealthy personality patterns can help us tackle this, so let's go through some typical ones. The first category of common problems relate to low self-esteem, especially in relation to others. Perhaps you or people around you have noticed you are very critical of yourself, with large amounts of shame, a sense of inadequacy, a hopeless or helpless personality, or only care for yourself properly or give yourself what you need, if you meet certain conditions. Or perhaps you just have low self-esteem amongst others, with a large concern about social acceptability, a resistance to seek help, a personality of compliance, conscientiousness or shyness, or seeming laid back and very likable. Maybe you have an obsessive need to please, or you're not honest with yourself and others. Likewise, compulsive caregiving, even at times when you yourself are in need, always compromising for others and never saying no, and the tendency to feel guilty a lot, along with an inability to speak to people directly and set boundaries. Sometimes, we can also develop an unhealthy fusion with others. Perhaps you have a weak sense of self, losing yourself around others, a self-esteem tied up with work and an inability to separate from it, strong convictions rather than a calm sense of self, or an inability to recognize or remember boundaries. Or perhaps you are dependent on others. In a more hostile way, having poor and unstable relationships can also sometimes cause people to become bullies later in life, a warped way of maintaining some form of self-esteem and social standing. Another way our personalities can morph is by not being centered to yourself. Sometimes, people are in a state of distance and denial. This can be seen through having a pseudo-independence and not needy self-sufficiency, or having a lot of secrets and feeling like no one else can understand you. It can also look like perfectionism or high levels of rigidity, moralizing, overplanning, anxiety, OCD behaviors, or a constant need to be in control or take charge. Sometimes people never relax enough to experience their own futility. Some people struggle with a dissociation from emotion, running from him, or bottling them up. There can be a tendency to put up with pain, a guarding of emotional expression, or a personality of being never stressed, immune to fatigue, or avoiding thinking negatively. Sometimes it's subtle, an inability to experience emotions consciously, whether an inability to use words to describe emotions in the present or when talking about your childhood, or having poor memory or difficulty telling fact from fiction. It can even sometimes materialize in people's voices, with people having a resonant voice with no emotion. And it can also show up in intellectualization. People may find themselves focusing too much on the mind versus listening to the heart, keeping anxiety at bay using a mountain of information, and externalizing problems versus looking inwards. This can be common in people who have grown up in families that prioritize intellectualization. Another way emotional dissociation presents is through problems with anger, hostility, rage, or explosive aggression. Instead of being upfront with the more vulnerable emotions of anger towards someone we love, is a form of running from them. And likewise, denying anger, or expressing anger through sarcasm, wit or comedy, is a common socially acceptable way to escape trauma. People with deep and early trauma can sometimes develop traits of constantly filling in the void. They might have an addictive personality, with avoidant coping strategies like daily drinking or eating disorders. Though they can also be more socially accepted, such as workaholism, being an adrenaline junkie, or an impulsiveness. People often have an energetic past, let stress run their life, have a relentless self-drive, are in a constant pursuit versus just allowing the present, and think fast and do everything fast. Though the key thing to remember when we're talking about personality is it's not about what could be considered wrong, or even what the personality is. Instead, it's all about figuring out where the person is not whole. We all need genuine self-esteem, to live authentically, and to love ourselves with a calm intimacy. It's all about where they are not living out their life in the ways they could, which will be different for different people. All living organisms are trying to maintain homeostasis, or a constant internal environment, regardless of whether the external environment changes. We are trying to stabilize everything from our temperature to our emotional state. Stress is what happens when we run into anything that threatens our homeostasis, whether real or perceived. Stress, both physiologically and psychologically, is just the attempt to get ourselves back to our stable point. To control our stress levels, we must be mindful of the things in our life that will disrupt our homeostasis. Being deprived of anything we need will cause stress, and likewise, what we're dependent on will alter how stressed we get. If we depend more on external factors or drugs to be stable, we'll have more stress. Likewise, certain personalities will make us more prone to stress. Sometimes, for example, people are stuck in a chronic state of fear, which primes their bodies into a constant heightened stress. The events throughout our life can also trigger our stress, whether major traumatic events or more hidden stress. One particular place that stress is often triggered is in our relationships, such as experiencing judgment from our family, or the internal stress of having to adjust oneself to something other than ourselves. Attachment anxiety has been shown to predict levels of an inflammation marker called IL-6. But the stress effect also extends to other relationships, like at work. For example, seniority ranking at work has been shown to be more important than smoking in the development of cardiovascular disease. Stress is very important in the development of physical diseases. It is very common, for example, for breast cancer patients to have had severe stress and physical exhaustion in the year before the diagnosis. Though, to tackle the problem, understanding stress is the key. Stress can come down to 4 things: a lack of information, a lack of control, uncertainty, and conflict. And the biggest stress in life is not usually physical, but emotional. Maintaining manageable stress levels will mean maximizing the amount of control, information, and security you have, whether more secure support or a better routine or structure. Especially when paying attention to what may be causing us emotional alarm. Our adult relationships play a big role in our health. Not only do we have attachment needs when we're a developing child, but all of us still have social needs in later life. As adults, we still need unconditional love, affection, and trust. We need a sense of belonging, relatedness, and connectedness, and need to be able to express ourselves, be vulnerable, and feel understood and seen. At a greater community level, we also need a culture to engage with, and a place in our community where we feel valued. More deeply, the spirit is important too. We must feel connected to and belonging to something bigger than ourselves, something for our soul, whether a purpose or meaning, or more religiously a transcendence. When it comes to our social needs, research really highlights 2 particular problems: social isolation and loneliness. They have been shown to increase cholesterol, mess with our hormones, and result in poorer cognitive functioning. Living alone, especially from a divorce or bereavement, results in a higher mortality risk. And the lack of emotional support, especially through a high-stress situation in the last year, is common in breast cancer patients. Our relationships will influence our biology in real time too. As most will be familiar with how tension with a friend or family member, for example, will quickly raise our heartbeat. Something that requires particular attention is our relationship dynamics, and whether or not they're healthy. It's vital that we have vulnerability and communication in our relationships. And important that we mustn't harbor bitterness, or end up stuck in fear. We've got to be able to have balanced and healthy interactions. able to have a good level of autonomy in relationships, following our inner desires and doing what is important for us without feeling guilt. Asserting boundaries when needed is essential for our health, keeping at arm's length things that will unnecessarily stress us. Equally, you should be able to express anger in a healthy way, not through rage, which is actually a form of anxiety, as you're too afraid to be vulnerable with your anger. Relationship dynamics can have strong links with disease. It seems that for many people, diseases are triggered by poor quality relationships or marriage dynamics. Perhaps you're not being yourself in the relationship, chasing someone, in a transactional dynamic, or being pushed down. Often the less powerful partner in the relationship absorbs the burden, and will be the one that comes out in disease. It is of course, also important to note that upon becoming ill, people become much more vulnerable to the family dynamic, and going through the illness itself can change our relationships. If we view illness from a different perspective, it can be quite helpful. Just as disease sometimes seems to be triggered by stress or relationship dynamics, we can see illness almost as a coping method of the body. What can't be coped with in life resolves itself in our physiology. There is plenty of evidence for it, along with evidence of the connection between the mind and disease. One study found that scientists could predict who got cancer with 94% accuracy when just looking at personality. Another found that the stress of migration increased men's chance of prostate cancer by 2.5 times. And another found that for smokers, a minimum emotional suppression was required for them to develop lung cancer, and severe emotional suppression makes it 40 times more likely. Men who are more dependent on others are also more likely to develop a number of diseases, including prostate cancer. After all, we know chronic stress can affect hormones and the nervous system, and we know many cancers are dependent on both of these. Moreover, it is becoming increasingly clear that the brain has a strong influence on the immune system, with too much stress in the brain causing a lack of energy for our immune system. What's also key to remember is that stress, relationships and personality can also indirectly impact disease likelihood. Stressed people who are poor at emotional regulation will be those who are more likely to smoke, comfort eat, or lack sleep. Tackling disease may mean looking a bit deeper into the holistic factors going on in our life. Whilst our backgrounds and environment clearly shape our biology, we forget that our current choices do too. Ultimately, our beliefs shape our reality. If we believe we're not worth a healthy relationship, and that illness is just our destiny, that's where we will end up. We cannot control 100% of what happens to us on the outside, but we can 100% control our response to it on the inside. Action forward is a choice, and you have the ability to make that choice.